Buckingham Palace, watching tourists trying to take photos in front of the huge gates. Suddenly, a man appeared in the crowd, unlike any other. He was walking fast, his movements were too precise, and his eyes were extremely calm. He seemed to be looking for someone, and he was no ordinary tourist. His dark suit seemed unnaturally heavy for such a hot day. I saw him approaching the royal guard. He was standing at his post, not moving, completely still. But something changed in the atmosphere. The man raised his hand and abruptly opened his jacket. I saw a pistol, and everything became clear. It was not just defiant behavior, it was danger. "Don't move." His voice sounded like a sharp cry in the silence. People froze. Tourists began to hide, but I couldn't take my eyes off the guard. He remained unflappable, as if nothing was happening. His gaze was forward, as always. But I thought I saw a slight change. He was no longer just standing there. He was ready for anything. The man raised his gun, and everyone started to get scared. I heard a small child screaming. My heart broke from fear for the people. But the guard stood there without moving a finger. What was going to happen next? I stood in the crowd, gazing at the majestic gates of Buckingham Palace, while people around me took pictures, laughed, and discussed their plans for the day. But when I turned my head, something changed. At first, it was nothing more than a feeling I couldn't explain. A man in a dark suit was walking across the square, and something about him was unusual. All the other tourists were stopping to look at the guardsman, smiling and taking photos, but he was not paying attention. His gaze was sharp and cold. He walked without hesitation, as if he knew where he was going and to whom. I watched him approach the guardsman on duty. He was in his place, as always, tall, in a red uniform, with a white hat. Nothing disturbed his calm. But the closer this man came, the more I felt some kind of pressure coming from him. If I had been more experienced, I probably would have realized right away that this was not just strange behavior. But I watched, hearing only my thoughts and the sound that hovered around me. Tourists talking, children screaming, birds calling. And suddenly I saw him pulling at the sleeve of his jacket and, clearly, without any doubt, revealing a gun. At first I could not believe my eyes. How? Why? He was approaching the guardsman. I couldn't figure out what to do. Something inside me screamed that I had to move, but there was nowhere to go. "Don't move." His voice sounded like a cold blow. It was not just an order, it was a threat. The man with the gun was standing right in front of the guard, and everything around him became quiet, as if someone had pressed the pause button. Children's screams, tourist conversations, everything suddenly stopped. Everyone's eyes were on that desperate face holding the gun, and the invisible barrier of fear he created permeated everything around him. The guard, as usual, did not react. He stood there, not moving a millimeter, as if it were a normal part of his job. But I saw his fingers tighten their grip on the wooden handle of his musket. It was the only sign that he was aware of the situation. It seemed that his reaction was completely unpredictable, like the training of a fighter who knows how to act in the most critical moments. The man with the gun was looking him in the face. Every movement was precise, deliberate, and it seemed as if he was waiting for the moment to make his move. His whole demeanor was on edge. You involuntarily notice the sweat on his forehead, the way his lips tighten as he gets closer to the guard. "I said don't move," he repeated, his voice becoming more intense. I felt my chest tighten with fear. What's going to happen next? My eyes moved around the crowd. People began to retreat quietly, children hiding behind their parents. But no one moved. No one dared to take a step. My gaze, which had always watched this scene, was clouded with horror. The guard remained unmoved. It was the moment when each of us realized that he had something in him. He was not just a guard in a uniform. He was a man who had been trained to remain calm in the best and worst moments. And as incredible as it may seem, he showed neither fear nor doubt. But suddenly something changed. The pistol glinted in the sun, and the man squeezed the trigger. Suddenly, the first shot rang out. There were screams, panic, and birds flew into the sky, creating chaos around. And at that moment I realized that there were no more chances. Now it was impossible to stand still in this situation. People's screams, panic, the smell of hot metal after the shot, all of this became one massive outburst. No one could understand what to do. Cell phones were in the air, trying to capture every moment, but who could really understand what was happening at that moment? The man with the gun stood there as if in complete control of the situation, but I could see his fingers trembling. He was on the verge. There was coldness in his eyes, but behind it was something much more: fear, uncertainty, and, it seemed, the beginning of an understanding that things were not going as planned. He looked at the crowd, at the guard, at every movement. And then he turned to everyone around him again, with extraordinary speed. Nobody moves. Everyone stays where they are. His voice sounded again, but this time with tension that was felt in every word. And that shot. A shot in the air, like a warning. I heard it echoing off the walls of the palace, reflecting off the asphalt. People in panic retreated even further. Some fell down, not knowing where to run. Mothers grabbed their children, pushing them toward them, saving them from the very disaster that was in front of them. The guard stood motionless, and it seemed that he did not react to the shot at all. His gaze remained fixed, directed forward, but now I noticed his hand on his musket tightened slightly. He was ready. I was sure of it. And although it was not visible to everyone, he was changing. The man holding the gun didn't know what to do next. His finger was still on the trigger, even though he hadn't fired. He shouted, his words sounding more and more nervous. "Will anyone try to go to the police? I will open fire right now." Everyone understood his voice, but no one moved. It seemed that the entire crowd had lost the ability to act, turning into a silent mass watching this absurd spectacle. But with every word that came out of this man's mouth, it seemed that he himself was losing control. "Have you gone completely crazy?" a voice from the crowd asked. An elderly man with military medals standing closer to the palace tried to intervene, but his words had no effect. He stepped forward, even though he knew it could be deadly. But he didn't care if he felt afraid. He was a soldier, and this man with a gun was a threat that could not be ignored. But the guard did not move again. The man with the gun kept glancing at the guard, realizing that he was standing there like a stone. His hand trembled, and he shouted again, "Don't move." But the more he shouted, the more it seemed pointless to him. Everyone fell silent, and even he began to doubt about his actions. But at that moment, I realized one thing, that no matter how hard the man with the gun tried to influence the situation, everything was changing. And it was not only a moment of strength, but also a moment when the guardsman showed real resilience. The way he continued to stand as if nothing had happened. How his eyes never looked away from what was happening. He remained incredibly composed, and even I began to realize that this might not turn out the way we all think. The man with the gun made a sudden movement, and it didn't even seem like he had a chance to correct himself. I saw his eyes full of nervous fear. Now he was not only in control of the situation, he was afraid that everything would get out of his control. Now the panic was obvious. People were confused, did not know where to run. Some were already on the verge of a nervous breakdown, while others just froze, trying to understand what was happening. Each of us began to assess the situation, subconsciously trying to decide what to do next. But the guard remained at his post. I looked at his constant, almost unrealistic composure, and something inside me said that he was not just waiting. He was ready for what would happen next. Meanwhile, the man with the gun standing in front of the guard was clearly losing control. His breathing was becoming labored, and his finger on the trigger was trembling. He saw how all his threats did not work, how people just silently backed away, and he realized that the situation was getting out of his control. And that's when he realized he couldn't just stand there and wait. All the phones. "Urgent," he shouted, trying to gather his will into a fist. People started throwing their cell phones on the ground, panicking even more, but the man didn't stop. He picked up his gun and checked it, as if looking for some kind of second chance. Faster. His voice changed, became deaf with anger, and his fingers on the gun tightened. And at that moment I realized that he was not just stealing, he was trying to control the situation, and this was no longer just a robbery. It was a struggle for domination. The guard didn't move, but I noticed how his posture changed. His gaze became more expressive, and although he was still completely still, I felt that he was assessing the situation, and every move was now calculated. And then he made the first move. Suddenly, and it was so fast that I barely had time to notice it, his right hand slipped to the man's gun. It wasn't just a gesture, it was executed with such precision that the man didn't even have time to realize what had happened. As soon as his finger left the trigger, the guardsman grabbed his arm and twisted it sharply, almost effortlessly, so that the gun was in his hands. The man tried to clench his fist, but the guard was already over him. The gun was torn from his hands, and its tip was now pointing directly at him. Everyone saw it, and I felt the air inside me shrink. With every movement of the guardsman, the man lost his confidence. At first, he tried to push away, but his movements were uncertain, chaotic. He was on the verge, his eyes flashing because he had just lost his leverage. All his threats became weaker, and his voice became more and more confused. "What are you doing?" he shouted when he realized that his gun was already in the hands of the guardsman. He did not accept it. He could not understand what was happening. There was something desperate in his voice. The man was on the verge of a nervous breakdown, and his self-confidence was crumbling in the face of the fact that he had no choice but to become more and more aggressive. "Don't do it," he shouted, trying to make another attempt to attack. But that was his last mistake. The guard did not respond. Only in his actions could you feel the tension. Every movement was so clear and precise, as if everything he did was part of a training session. His emotions were hidden, but his confidence was at an all-time high. "Stop," his voice was calm, but every word pierced the air like an order, and the moment the guard made his last maneuver turned everything around. He quickly threw the gun away, and this time his hand was holding it with all its strength, not giving him a chance to struggle. The man fell silent. Everyone was silent.